Mike White should keep starting at quarterback for the Jets. I did not think that was a controversial statement. However, some in the media seem to disagree. I'll explain why they are wrong and why Mike White should continue to be the Jets' starting quarterback, at least for the time being, today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, November 29th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. It helps the channel out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. So does giving this episode a big thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Well, the Jets are 7-4, coming off a big victory over the Chicago Bears Sunday at MetLife Stadium. They have another NFC North matchup this Sunday against the Minnesota Vikings. The Jets beat Chicago in part because Mike White was stellar in his first start of the season. He threw for 315 yards and 3 touchdowns. And the funny thing for Mike White is that's actually his worst season debut so far because, of course, last year he started against Cincinnati, his first game, and threw for 405 yards and 3 touchdowns. So Mike White taking a step back. I'm joking, of course, but after a brilliant performance, clearly the best Jets quarterback performance of the year, I think it's obvious Mike White will stay in the starting lineup. I think it's obvious he should stay in the starting lineup. I thought that was obvious to everybody. And to be fair, it seems like most people feel that way, but I did come across a few members of the media who were questioning why the Jets handled quarterback position the way they did. And to me, the answer is pretty obvious, but I guess it's not obvious to everybody. So we'll go through it on today's show. Now, I think you have to begin by looking at the position the Jets are in right now. They are 7-4. They hold the 7 seed in the AFC. So if the season ended today, Jets are going to the playoffs. This would end the Jets' 12. It would be a 12-year playoff drought. They've missed the playoffs 11 straight years. This is year 12. They have not been to the playoffs since 2010. And I'm not saying you try and go to the playoffs as like a short-sighted kind of thing. We all know teams, they're teams that make the wild card round and they're never heard from again. They're teams that are kind of one-year wonders. But that does not seem like the direction the Jets are going in. The Jets seem like a team on the rise because they are flooded with young talent. This would be a huge step forward. And sometimes I think we overthink things. If you're 7-4, your goal should be to make the playoffs. I keep hearing people say, well, the goal is really to get Zach Wilson experience. Well, in an ideal world, you'd be doing both. In an ideal world, Zach Wilson would be playing great, and he'd be a reason you're in position to make the playoffs. That simply has not been the case. I always hear people separate the quarterback play, the quarterback development, from the team's success. And at the beginning of the season, they'll say something like, I'd rather the team lose and have the quarterback develop than have the team go to the playoffs. And listen, I understand the argument. And I think that there's a case to be made. If Zach Wilson was having a great season, and this is a hypothetical, but if Zach Wilson was having a great season, and maybe the defense wasn't as good as it's turned out to be, and the Jets, have a losing record, maybe a 6-win season, a 7-win kind of season, but Zach Wilson looks like he's really taking a step forward, I think you could call that season a success, even if the Jets missed the playoffs. But a season where Zach Wilson's struggling and the Jets miss the playoffs, that's not really a success, even if you've padded your win total, especially where the Jets are right now. Teams don't go from 4 wins to the Super Bowl. They don't go from 2 in 2020 to 4 in 2021 all the way to the Super Bowl. It takes more time than that. So I see people say, well, the Jets can't win the Super Bowl this year. Well, first of all, that's not true. Now, listen, would I bet on the Jets to win the Super Bowl? No, because I'd never bet on any individual team to win the Super Bowl. The odds are against any team. Football Outsiders puts together this algorithm. It's a great statistical website. They put together this algorithm, and they try and estimate every team's odds of winning the Super Bowl. Philadelphia Eagles have the best odds, 22.8%. So the team with the best chance has less than a 1 in 4 chance of winning the Super Bowl. That's because there are lots of good teams competing. That's because a lot of it comes down to luck. So you can't say, any individual team's definitely going to win. If Zach Wilson were to develop, there'd be no guarantee the Jets would be able to, the Jets would be guaranteed to win the Super Bowl. The odds would be against the Jets anyway. But you got a shot to make the playoffs. And I'm sorry, making the playoffs for this team, there are teams that, they spend lavishly in free agency. They bring in these veteran rosters, and they're one and done in the playoffs, and they're never heard from again. That's not the situation the Jets are in. I think, listen, you can never prove it. I think it would be a big step forward for the Jets to make the playoffs this year. But beyond that, how do we get to a point in the NFL where the top goal is anything other than win? How does that make any sense? How do we overthink things to this extent that winning games is something that's not the focus? The focus is always winning games. So, I don't understand it. And the other aspect of this is people are talking about Zach Wilson's development. Well, Zach Wilson, the reason he's on the bench is he really hasn't developed. And as much as people may argue, well, he needs to be out there so he can improve, where's the data that backs up that Zach Wilson's going to improve the more he's on the field? Because, I can give you some numbers right now from year 1 to year 2. This is how much playing experience has helped him. I looked at his median game. So the game that's kind of like the middle of the pack game for him. And I took each statistic is its own game. So I'm not taking one game here. I'm taking the game that's the median completion percentage game, the median yardage game, the median passer rating game, and the median yards per attempt game. His rookie season, Zach Wilson's median completion percentage in one game was 57.5%. This year, 55.5%. So 57.5 as a rookie, 55.5 this year. A little bit lower, same ballpark. Median yardage in a game, 192 last year, 154 this year. So lower. Jets are a little bit more run-oriented this year, so even though it's lower, okay, you can live with that. But not a sign that Zach Wilson's really delivering, certainly. Even when you factor that in, I'd say most charitable case is probably even. Let's go to passer rating. Median game last year, 73.3. Median game this year, 72.8. That's 72.8. So 73.3 last year, 72.8 this year. Almost identical. Yards per attempt. Median game last year, 6.0. Median game this year, 6.1. 6.0 last year, 6.1 this year. So essentially the median performance for Zach Wilson has not changed. Those numbers are almost identical. So if you're arguing that he needs to play to develop, well, he hasn't been developing. He hasn't been improving. So the argument, despite playing this year, despite all these extra games he's got experience in, there's no correlation between him playing games and him improving. And I'm going to throw another point out here. Do you think Mike White could have thrown for 315 yards his first year in the league, his second year in the league? I happen to think no. Maybe you disagree with that. That's fine. But I don't think he could. I think he's gotten better over the course of his career. And why do I think he's gotten better? I think he's worked hard on the practice field. I think he's gotten the Jets system down. I think he's figured out defenses working on that practice field. Well, if Mike White can develop that way, why can't Zach Wilson? And that's one of the areas where this argument just completely falls apart for me. I don't know where it feels very arbitrary to say, and there's always a great debate going on about whether a quarterback's better sitting or whether he's better playing. There's no definitive answer because we don't know what the alternative would be. This goes all the way back to Mark Sanchez. There are people, I kind of agree with them, that Mark Sanchez may have been better off if he had sat early in his career. We can never prove it, though, because there's no alternative that we'll ever see where Mark Sanchez did sit, and we'll never find out how his career turned out that way. But, you see quarterbacks who don't succeed when they play. You see quarterbacks who do succeed when they sit. So, for me, the whole argument, even if it's about Zach Wilson's development, kind of falls apart when you say he needs to play to develop. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. I don't think it's something that really holds up to scrutiny. So I think the Jets, if you're going to sacrifice your best chance at making the playoffs, let's say for the sake of argument that Mike White playing is the Jets' best chance of making the playoffs, if you're going to sacrifice that, there needs to be a good reason for it. And the whole thing Zach Wilson needs to play to develop, well, there's a couple of points here that kind of go against that. Of course, that's not the only reason I think Mike White should stay in the lineup. I think he's playing really well. And I also think we're to a point in Zach Wilson's career where you can't just dismiss his performance as he's young, as he's inexperienced. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we continue this Tuesday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Turo. Turo is the world's largest car-sharing marketplace. With Turo, you can book any car you want, wherever you want it, from a community of local hosts. You can browse a huge selection of vehicles for just about any occasion or budget across the US, Canada, and Australia, and the UK. Book a spacious SUV or minivan for a family road trip. Get a classic or luxury car for a special event, birthday, or holiday. Find affordable economy cars if you're on a budget and just need to get from point A to point B. Test drive that electric vehicle you've had your eye on to see how it fits into your everyday life. Maybe you're heading to Minnesota this weekend for the game and you need to figure out how to get to the stadium. Many Turo hosts can deliver the car right to you. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. Forget boring rental cars and find your drive at Turo.com. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. We're talking today why Mike White should stay in the lineup, at least for now. If it wasn't obvious, Mike White did lead the Jets to a win on Sunday, threw for 315 yards, gave the Jets the best quarterback performance of the year. But I've still seen, and now it's not everybody, in fairness, there are lots of people in the media who understand why Mike White should be in the lineup, but I've seen a couple voices say the Jets have botched the situation, which tough for me to understand. It's not like Zach Wilson was playing great and the Jets pulled the rug out from under him. The reason Zach Wilson's on the bench is he hasn't played well enough. And we talk about developing a quarterback. I think people forget, isn't part of developing as a quarterback proving you're the best quarterback on the team? Isn't it earning your starting job, ending all doubt that you should be in the lineup? Well, if you haven't done those things, you really haven't developed. You haven't developed acceptably. And at this point in time, I'm not saying Zach Wilson's career is over, but he's at a point where I don't think you can just dismiss his struggles. I looked something up yesterday. I looked up quarterbacks who are who had comparable beginnings to their career as what Zach Wilson has produced in his 2 years in the league. So what I did was I took a look at quarterbacks who, in the last 25 years, who have started at least 20 games in their first 2 years, and put up comparable numbers to Zach Wilson. So what was I looking for? Well, I was looking for quarterbacks who had an interception percentage that matched Zach Wilson's or was higher at 2.8%. Quarterbacks who matched his completion percentage, 55.6%, that or lower. And Zach Wilson's yards per attempt, 6.3 or lower in those 20 games. And the reason I did that, completion percentage, yards per attempt, interception rate, that's a good sample of quarterback play because completion percentage shows you accuracy, yards per attempt shows you efficiency, interception rate shows you how you protect the football. And these three, sometimes one of these three is really good, but it's deceptive. So like you could have a high completion percentage and a low interception rate, but if your yards per attempt is low, it means you're not playing very efficient football. Whereas you may have a low completion percentage and a high interception rate, but if your yards per attempt is high, it shows that you're gaining chunk plays, you're making big plays for your team. So a combination of all three of these being not great, that's a sign that there's trouble because you're not really doing anything all that well. So who are these quarterbacks who have played at a comparable level to Zach Wilson? Last 25 years, started at least 20 games. There's only three names, and these are not great names. You've got Joey Harrington, you've got David Carr, and you've got Kyle Bowler. Those are the three. And ironically, all three of those guys were drafted in either 2002 or 2003. So 02-03, that was not the golden age of quarterback drafting in the NFL. In fact, I think Rex Grossman was 03 as well. So that was an ugly couple of years in the NFL, aside from Carson Palmer. And maybe I'm forgetting something else. But it's amazing that in 25 years, you had those three. The only time it happened prior to Zach Wilson was those three guys. But look at those guys. We're to the point 20 games into your career. It doesn't sound like a lot, and you can't judge every quarterback, but if you're playing at a certain level, if you're playing at a certain threshold, it's a sign that, things are not going your way. It's a sign that, it's going to be tough to overcome this because I do think we kind of forget something about quarterbacks. And it's something we forget about all players. Most players don't have an infinite ability to improve. For most players, I think, there's a certain amount of improvement you can expect through their career. It's not, we always think a young player, you've got unlimited potential. It's tough though, because if you're starting from like 0.7 then you can get to point 10 pretty easily. It's much more difficult to get from point 1 to point 10. If you're really at the bottom of the league, getting all the way to the top, it's a very long trip. And it shows how difficult it is. It shows you the guys, Zach Wilson's contemporaries, who they are. I'm not saying Zach Wilson's career is over. He could be an outlier. There are always exceptions to the rule. But the question is, do you want to count on this guy being an exception? Because ultimately, really what you're doing, if you put Zach Wilson in the lineup, and I think you can say this right now, I think you can, maybe not with certainty, but I think things are pointing in this direction. If you're putting Zach Wilson in the lineup, you're probably reducing your odds of getting to the playoffs. And I'm saying that based on how Mike White's played. I'm saying that based on how Zach Wilson's played. So what's the trade-off here? So if you're reducing your odds of making the playoffs, and I understand, the Jets are not the favorite in the AFC, but if you're reducing your odds of making the playoffs, what are you getting out of it? And what are the odds Zach Wilson's actually going to deliver at the level you want him to deliver? I don't know that that's really a good trade-off for the Jets, even if you're not expecting a Super Bowl win, because it feels like the odds are against Zach Wilson right now. And I understand he was the second overall pick. At some point, though, a 2-year-old evaluation from before he took a snap in the NFL ceases to matter. And if we're talking about who has the most potential, well, here's something I got to tell you. Mike White's he started 4 games in the NFL. Zach Wilson started 20. So let's take these 24 games. 4 Mike White starts, 20 Zach Wilson starts. Now let's take the passer rating these quarterbacks have had in every game. If you take these 24 games, the 4 Mike White starts, 20 Zach Wilson starts, Mike White has the 3 highest single game passer ratings. Now you want to say there's one thing there's one caveat here. That includes a game last year Mike White played against the Colts where he only played 1 quarter. So you want to throw that out, that's fine. That's fair, because he did not play that game from start to finish. We could also throw out a game Zach Wilson played against New England last year. Mike White's 3 starts then has the 2 highest single game passer ratings. So if we're talking about who has the best chance to develop right now, if you took a guy, if you took somebody who didn't know their pedigrees, if you took somebody who didn't know that Zach Wilson was the second overall pick and Mike White was a 5th round pick who got cut and was on the practice squad, if you took somebody who just saw these guys for the first time, you saw Mike White's mechanics, saw Mike White's ability to read a defense, I think that guy's probably concluding Mike White's the guy with more upside. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be that way forever, but at some point you just need to say what you see. Listen, I've tried for 2 years to find a way for Zach Wilson to be successful. I've tried to talk myself into it. I've tried to talk you into it. I've tried to say this is the pathway. I've tried to say this is encouraging. At some point you have to say, things are not where they need to be right now. And things may never get to where they need to be. And the Jets need to try and win games. Again, this is the thing that just boggles my mind. The idea that the Jets are not in the business of winning games. After not making the playoffs since 2010, the idea that the Jets, they're not supposed to be trying to win games this year. It goes back to something I said earlier. They try and divorce quarterback development from the team's performance. You can't really do it. Now, there are scenarios where maybe Zach Wilson developed, but the team wasn't ready. The team's ready this year. And Zach Wilson just hasn't been good enough. That's why Mike White's in the lineup. And listen, as long as I didn't think Mike White had this in him. I did not think Mike White would have 2 great games out of 3 as a starting quarterback in the NFL. But at some point, you got to say, this is what's happened. You got to go with what you see. But I'm not saying Mike White necessarily should have the job guaranteed to him for the rest of the year. I think there are certain thresholds Mike White needs to hit. And if he doesn't get them, back to the bench he should go. And maybe Zach Wilson should go in. And I'll explain what I mean as we continue this Tuesday episode ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Audible. Audible is releasing a new slate of football podcasts that we're sure you're going to love. Find Block Forever now wherever you get your podcasts. Block Forever is a brand new podcast from former NFL All-Pro and former New York Jet Ryan Khalil and Audible. Khalil takes the conversation about football to the next level. He gives football fans an insider's look at the game through the eyes of great players and the greatest personalities of all time. Khalil sits down with star players, coaches, and former pros across the league to get real about what happens on the field and behind the scenes, inside the locker room, during team meetings, and back at the hotel. You'll hear Christian McCaffrey talk about his love-hate relationship with fantasy football, and Juju Smith-Schuster give his most honest opinions about other players and positions in the league. New episodes of Block Forever will be recorded and released every week ahead of Thursday Night Football. Ryan and guests discuss topics like the player's psyche, sports betting, playing through pain, being a leader, and how to deal with combative teammates. Nothing is out of bounds here. It's available for free on Audible or wherever you get your podcasts. So catch the full Block Forever series, available anywhere you get your podcasts. Available everywhere now. Audible. Get in the game. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. I've been talking about why Mike White should stay in the lineup for the Jets at the quarterback position, but I'm not saying Mike White necessarily should stay in the lineup for the rest of the year. This is a results-oriented business. Jets have to try and win games. I'm going to re-emphasize that over and over. The Jets need to try and win games. It's a radical thought, apparently, but it needs to be said. With that in mind, Mike White needs to continue to justify his spot in the lineup. That was an excellent performance on Sunday, but if he doesn't follow it up, then we'll be back to square one. We'll be talking about what the Jets should do at the quarterback position. Now, I'll say this. Mike White played the best quarterback game of the year on Sunday for the Jets by far. So with that in mind, you've seen the upside there. I think Mike White has earned maybe, if he plays poorly against Minnesota, I think he's earned a reprieve. But that doesn't go on forever. Mike White needs to show that he continues to be the best option. If he goes out there and really struggles going forward, then we could talk about perhaps making another change. Now, I think it's the best thing for the Jets if he goes out there and continues to play well, because Robert Saleh has indicated that this was not 100% performance related with Zach Wilson, the benching. He's indicated, Zach Wilson maybe could use a mental break. There are things Zach Wilson needs to work on, and obviously a lot of those are mechanically. And I'm not sure Zach Wilson's mechanics are to a point where they're fixable in a couple of weeks. They could conceivably be fixable over the long run. I'm not saying they're guaranteed to be fixable, but I could see like a scenario where full offseason of work, maybe he can come back better next year. I think it's going to be very difficult to do it in the time frame the Jets would need him if he's going to play again this year. But the Jets, again, the Jets have to try and win games. And if Mike White struggles, if the interceptions return, if he plays a couple of games like he did last year against Buffalo. Now, right now, you're looking at this, and I'm looking at this, and I'm saying 3.25 starts. 2.25 of those were pretty good. The Buffalo game was rough, where he threw 4 interceptions. And there's a question, was that just because Buffalo had a great defense? Or is that more indicative of the player Mike White is than the games against Cincinnati and the game this week against the Chicago Bears? Well, we'll find that out. And any quarterback, we don't really know how good he is after 3.25 games. It takes more than that. And after the league gets some film on you, they kind of figure out, these are the things maybe this guy's not so great at. We'll test him out. That's one of the things that determines whether or not you stick in this league. There are lots of guys who go out there and light it up at the very beginning of their careers. The question is, after the league kind of figures out how to test you, can you do enough? Can you turn weaknesses into strengths, but can you prevent weaknesses from being the things that destroy you? That's something that's unknown right now. It's something we'll find out going forward with Mike White. So I think that ultimately the message Robert Saleh sent was good. And I loved something that we heard on the broadcast on Sunday, where they related it to Robert Saleh's experience when he was an assistant coach just coming up with the Seattle Seahawks. And that was a point where the Seahawks had given a quarterback, Matt Flynn, a veteran quarterback who had backed up Aaron Rodgers. They gave him a decent sized contract. It was not franchise quarterback money, but they signed him in free agency. They gave him a decent amount of money. That was the year they drafted Russell Wilson. And they were never expecting Russell Wilson to be that good that fast. But despite the fact they paid Matt Flynn all this money, Pete Carroll felt like Russell Wilson gave them the best chance to win. So you know what? It doesn't matter that this guy's making a lot of money. The better quarterback's going to play. And Russell Wilson went into the lineup, and the rest was history. Same thing applies with the Jets. And that's one of the things I love is that draft positions doesn't matter. And even at the running back position, you saw it a little bit. The Jets traded a draft pick for James Robinson, but Robert Saleh deemed Bam Knight the better running back on Sunday. So Bam Knight went into the lineup. It made no difference that the Jets traded for James Robinson a few weeks ago. At quarterback, it's tougher to do, though. The Jets did it, though. They benched the second overall pick because they felt another quarterback gave them a better chance to win. But they'll only view that if Mike White continues to play effective football. And if he reverts back to that, those interceptions, then it'll be time to make another change. I don't think one game guarantees Mike White the job for life. I don't think it guarantees him the job for the rest of the season. It's all about performance. And that's the reason Zach Wilson's on the bench. Zach Wilson did not perform well enough. So while I'm saying Mike White should be the quarterback for now, I'm saying he's got to keep proving himself every week. Now we can live with maybe a bad game here or there, but multiple bad games and we're right back to where we were. Hopefully it doesn't come to that, though. And I think the best thing for the Jets is obviously Mike White going out there, continuing to play great football and leading the Jets to the playoffs. Let's hope it happens. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button. You'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help out the channel, help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Tuesday, everybody. Send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we will do our weekly mailbag show.